Let's see. There it goes. Okay. So there's this old Greek poet Archilochus who had a famous phrase that was a fox knows many things, but a hedgehog one important thing. And this concept, this idea has stuck around for a couple thousand years now. And it's based in the idea that foxes and hedgehogs, they get their food differently, right? What is a fox? A fox is a canine of sorts and is one of nature's great generalists. It is able to survive. There's literally desert foxes and Arctic foxes and everything in between. And those foxes can survive and thrive eating a lot of different kind of food, right? They can eat rubbish. They can eat mushrooms. They can eat fish. They can eat carrion. They can catch a wild animal. That is one of the remarkable things about a fox. And a hedgehog, by contrast, is an animal that is a bit of a specialist, isn't it? It lives underground half the time. It looks for particular kinds of grubs and insects. It only exists in the wild and in a few places in the United Kingdom. And as a result, you could look at this as an example of an animal that's really found its niche and is thriving in that niche. And so I often like to ask my students, are you a hedgehog or a fox? Right? Are you somebody who has this great technical skill set and you've got yourself in a job where you know exactly what you're doing and you're absolutely killing it? Or are you in a position to say, hey, look, I do a whole bunch of different things well, right? I'm not an expert in any of them, but I've got enough skills and capacity and experience that I can uh, go out there and jump into new situations, new circumstances, and thrive. And this idea of hedgehog versus foxes is something that I think about a lot in terms of leadership in particular leadership as it relates to like setting a long-term vision and strategy for your organization. Now, one of the things is that it's expensive and difficult to be a fox, right? It's difficult to follow what's going on in the world of aviation and in the world of healthcare and in the world of artificial intelligence and in the world of geopolitics and in the world of the energy transition. These are all huge, complicated topics. They could take up all of your time and energy. How are you going to focus on all of these things, right? Indeed, the pressure that we face right now is to be hedgehogs, right? It's like not only are you an engineer, you're an electrical engineer. Not only you're an electrical engineer, you work on energy systems in the thermal energy space. And not only are you an expert in the thermal energy space, but you have a particular function within the thermal energy plant that you focus on. And this is a reflection of the fact that the world just keeps getting more complicated. The systems, the technology, the expectations, the policy process, everything we engage with keeps getting more complicated. And I point to this article put out in 2014 by Mutz and Berman, who look at this idea that over time, scientific output just keeps increasing, right? It doubles every 9 years. The amount of scientific literature there is out there to read just continues to grow. So you begin your undergraduate studies, you spend 4 or 5 years in school, you do a master's degree, and by the end of your PhD, everything that there is to know in your chosen domain has doubled. So you have no choice to become a hedgehog, right? You have to focus in. But that's science, that's academia, right? Those are technical, robust, knowledge-based skill sets. There's downsides to that focus. There's downsides to being too much of a hedgehog. And I think we could find some interesting examples by looking at business strategy. I'm going to pick a few. Nick Hayek was the CEO of the Swatch company. This is the big Swiss watch manufacturing conglomerate that makes all sorts of interesting and different things. And when the Apple Watch was announced, about, I guess it would be 10 years ago now, the Apple Watch was announced, and the next day, Nick is asked by a reporter, "Hey, are you worried about this new device being made by Apple? Anything you should be worried about here?" He said, "Nah, it's an interesting toy, but not a revolution." Now, this obviously has aged poorly. The Apple Watch now sells more by revenue than the entire Swiss watch industry, right? Nick was a hedgehog. He understood his industry. He couldn't imagine that a tech company out of Silicon Valley in the United States would come along and come up with a product that is seen as desirable and luxurious and is useful in all sorts of ways that extend well beyond the capacities of any watch. Right? And so his hedgehogginess got in the way of a sense of curiosity and understanding of what might be possible in terms of what is adorned to your wrist. Let me pick Ed Colligan, the CEO of Palm. Some of you might be like me, old enough to remember Palm. Palm was a personal digital assistant manufacturer. They made little devices, kind of like a predecessor to the smartphone that had your emails and your contacts and your calendars. It was all very helpful in the early 2000s. And Ed had massive market share, right? First mover advantage, strong brand, strong technical product. And when he was asked, "Are you worried about the iPhone?" the day after Steve Jobs announced that new device, he said, "Are you worried?" Nah, these PC guys, he was referring to Apple as a PC personal computer maker. They're not going to figure this out. They're not going to just walk in, right? Again, I don't even think Palm exists anymore. And Apple as well. Apple. Steve Ballmer was the CEO of Microsoft, and in the early 2000s, he was, fighting with a new set of competitors, right? Google being one of them. And he looked at Google and said, "This is not a real company. It's a house of cards." Now, obviously, Microsoft is still doing very well, most valuable company on earth. But his assessment of a web-based company that was just monetizing search through a marketplace for ads was obviously very wrong. He couldn't get out of this notion of being an enterprise software sales entity. He couldn't imagine that there'd be otherwise to monetize the web that extended well beyond what Microsoft was doing. I have to pick on Steve Jobs, now departed CEO of Apple, because when he was asked about the Amazon Kindle, an e-ink reader supporting digital, book downloads and reading, he was asked, "Are you worried about this? These big screens, this marketplace that Amazon wants to set up?" It doesn't matter how good or bad the product is. The fact is that people don't read anymore, right? Didn't age well. Mike Glenn was the executive vice president of FedEx, a big American shipping company founded in the 1970s that took decades to build out the infrastructure, the warehousing, the logistics, the plane, the staffing, the trucks, the capacity to ship a package anywhere. And when Mike was asked, "Are you worried about Amazon building its own warehouses? Are you worried about Amazon hiring its own truck drivers, buying and leasing its own planes? Do you think they're going to figure this out?" And he said, "Look, it would be a daunting task, requiring tens of billions of dollars in capital and years to build to replicate existing networks like FedEx." He was asked this because at the time, Amazon was one of FedEx's best customers. They were delivering Amazon packages, and Jeff Bezos said, "I don't want to rely on a third party to do this for me. I want 1 hour or same day or next day delivery. I want my own infrastructure, and I am going to actually invest in all that to make it happen." Jim Keyes was the CEO of Blockbuster. He was offered an opportunity to buy Netflix. For those who don't know, Blockbuster was a video rental store. You would go in and rent a VHS tape, right? And on that tape, you had to return it maybe 24, 36, 48 hours later, depending on the product you were renting. And Blockbuster's main source of revenue as a video rental service was late fees and popcorn, right? They got you on the late fees when you forgot to bring it in, and they got you on the popcorn as you were standing in the aisle waiting to check out. They looked at Netflix's business model as unlimited content distribution. They said, "This is nuts. This doesn't make any sense." Right? You can't just give any people unlimited movies all the time for a flat fee. It didn't fit into his hedgehog mindset about what his business was. Indeed, he had no incentive to invest in a company like Netflix because he was making so much money off of late fees and popcorn sales. And so here you can start to see a pattern. Right? Being a specialist is very helpful when you want to crank out as much profit as possible from late fees. But being a generalist, having some foxiness to you, is very useful if you don't imagine where the future is going. And so everything that I've described thus far fits rather neatly into a framework that was developed by a researcher at Harvard called Clayton Christensen. He refers to this as the innovator's dilemma. And in this framework, he describes that disruptive technology, new ideas, always starts where the demands on the technology are relatively low, right? It doesn't meet the highest, most demanding use case scenario. No, no, no. It starts with a low quality use case scenario. And then over time, the disruptor comes along and starts attacking new products, new service lines, new ways of doing business. Let's use Netflix because it's such a famous example. How did Netflix start? Right? A mail order DVD subscription company. What was its next iteration? Well, they started doing streaming, but not necessarily for the best titles, not the most popular titles, right? They leveraged their catalog of mail order DVD subscriptions to acquire the streaming rights for those same things. Over time, their catalog of mail order rights got better. It started off very niche. It started off like obscure European art house movies from the 1960s. And then it became, oh, I could get Friends or Seinfeld or a Marvel movie. So they start moving up from obscure movies by mail to popular movies by mail, a medium quality use, to streaming popular movies, to creating popular content. Stranger Things, right? Wednesday, House of Cards. These titles that captured the public attention and imagination and actually became their biggest source of stickiness as a platform, right? Nobody goes to Netflix to watch other people's content now. You go to Netflix to watch Netflix content. And the fact that they managed to achieve this success in about 20 years is remarkable. And Hollywood is still trying to figure this out, right? The fact that they have gone from a nascent technological startup to the dominant producer of content in popular media. And so, one of the things that we talk a lot about when we try to get our students more comfortable and literate with ideas of strategy and innovation, of cultivating and nurturing your abilities to be a fox, is this notion that in ambiguous situations, questions are better than answers, right? Are you focusing on the right questions? Are you asking the right questions about who your customer is, what they're interested in, what motivates them, what excites them, right? Sometimes our technical skill sets lead us to want to answer things really quickly, to to go towards a high degree of certainty, to think that like with enough numbers or enough math or enough reading, we can get there. But when you're trying to think about the future of a health system or an energy system or transportation system, it's not about having the right answers, but am I asking the right questions? The other thing that we've identified is that again and again, folks want to think that the solution to some of our big challenges is like a technology, that I just need to lock myself away in a lab and come up with something new. I need to invent something. But increasingly, what we see is that actually what matters is 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 creating a strategy, a way of bringing together existing processes, existing products, services, packaging them together in new and compelling ways. Like what did Netflix invent? They didn't invent the DVD. They didn't invent the mail service. They didn't invent streaming. They didn't invent the internet. They didn't invent content production. But they had a strategy for pulling all of those things together that nobody else had. Right? They had a willingness to live with ambiguity, to ask great questions, to get feedback on those questions, to iterate, to recognize that we have to become a real fox in the world of content production. And so this represents a different way of thinking about the world, right? We are largely familiar in the sciences and engineering with a sense of deductive reasoning, right? There's an overarching paradigm theory that explains how the world works. Let's say Newton's laws of gravity. And Newton's law of gravity makes a prediction about the speed, velocity, and mass and whatnot in terms of the implications if I drop a pencil, right? That prediction can be observed and is found to be true, right? Thus validating the theory. But when it comes to something ambiguous, like what do people like to watch? How do they like to shop? Right? What's their preferences? All you can do is make observations, right? You can't experiment on them. You can make observations and you can look for patterns in those observations and roll those together into a set of generalizations. And then those generalizations may roll up into some kind of paradigm. You're engaged in what we refer to as inductive reasoning, right? All you can do is induce from the evidence around you some general idea of how the world works. It's not perfect. There's ambiguity, there's uncertainty. Your paradigm may evolve, but it's a different way of approaching the truth. Now, we like deductive reasoning. It produces great results. It puts planes in the sky. It creates vaccines. It builds bridges. I love it. Don't get me wrong. But sometimes in leadership positions, like when it comes to managing a team or managing someone's emotions or being a persuasive storyteller, this is not about deduction. This is not about experimentation. It's just a different way of approaching the truth. And so this requires us to cultivate a different set of skills. And I know the right brain, left brain thing has, not been debunked so much as seen as less binary than we understand it. However, we'll argue that there's some of us out there who are hedgehogs who loved organic chemistry or loved studying thermodynamics or loved clinical studies, whatever it might be, who need to recognize that maybe your weak spot is persuasion. Maybe your weak spot is studying organizational behavior, leadership, team dynamics. Maybe your weak spot is living with ambiguity, trying to define what strategy actually is. And so one of the things that I've observed in my 7 years of working with the MEL and MHLP programs is that the folks who come into these programs are technical leaders with robust toolkits. You make life and death decisions. This is the thing that brings them together, right? You build things, build processes, you treat people, right? There's common thread of the fact that what you do is really consequential. And you need this ability to look at things clearly, objectively, rationally. But as you know, if you've looked at this program, there's a lot of business content, organizational behavior, strategy and innovation, business immersion, business electives, sustainability and leadership. And in all of these instances, there's a lot of uncertainty that we have to wrestle with, right? There's this balance between truth and belief, right? There isn't a single source of truth about what motivates a person, right? How do I motivate a team? Oftentimes it's a story. Oftentimes you have to be a bit of a chameleon. You have to be a bit of a fox. So one of the things I've also observed in my time here is that your why is a bit different. You want to go from doing things to leading things, right? You've got enough experience executing, filling out the Excel spreadsheet, doing the 12, 18, 24-hour shifts. You want to impart that knowledge onto somebody else. You want to manage a team. You want to manage a project. You want to take your technical skills and strengthen them. This, of course, makes sense. You also recognize you want to layer on top of that some leadership skills, getting comfortable with ambiguity, comfortable with the tools of business. And so, what do we need to learn to do in this instance? We need to learn how to make persuasive, evidence-based arguments that acknowledge the limits of what we control, right? We have to get comfortable with inductive reasoning. We have to get comfortable with being a fox. And one of the things is that oftentimes when I start teaching folks this content, first idea that comes to their mind is like, well, this is fluff. It's not as hard as thermodynamics, right? It's not as hard as organic chemistry. Why am I doing this fluffiness? And I say, look, that's selling the content short. These are how empires are built. These are how teams are motivated. This is how technology is brought to market. This is how disruption happens, right? By respecting ambiguity, by having the curiosity of a fox, by willingness to go out into those spaces. And so one of the things that I do, and I know we're a small group today, so I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, but when we're in a classroom setting, one of the things I always ask people to do is give me an example of a strategic success that you were a part of. Can you even define a strategic success, right, where you see that choices were made to be something or not be something, that there's thought and consideration that went into thinking about how the choices you're making fit together because you've identified some unique value proposition, some unfair advantage, some competitive thing that you can do that your peers, competitors cannot, right? That it all fits together to leverage your team, your technology, the market, the time and place that you're in some compelling ways, right? And we get folks to come to the front of the room and share what strategic success looks like. And sometimes people really struggle. You see people with 20-year careers who struggle to even know what strategy is. They'll talk about having gone to a strategic planning meeting, but those strategic planning meetings oftentimes are just like team building in disguise, right? You're not actually strategizing anything. right? And we sit down, and one of the things that we always try and do in these programs is get people to interact, right? I could give you my feedback, but what's really interesting is the feedback of your peers. And when it gets even more interesting is when an engineer's definition of strategy gets challenged or improved from a nurse or a dentist or an occupational therapist. The other thing that we really get folks to think through is the opposite of success. Everyone wants to flex on their success. What about failure? Right? One of the things that's really uncomfortable for folks coming from technical backgrounds, architecture, planning, engineering, nursing, is to recognize that failure can be good. That failure is productive. You learn more from failure than you do from success. Right? You learn about, so oftentimes we are successful, but we haven't thought deeply about something, and so we're just lucky when we're successful, right? But what we have to recognize is that sometimes we're going to fail. And we are programmed from a very early age to think that failure is bad. And this can be not only true in different cultural contexts, but it's very true in different professions. And look, you don't want to fail when you're dealing with an infant in the NICU and you're trying to save their life. You don't want to fail when you're trying to keep an energy plant running. You don't want to fail when you're designing a new building. That's fine. But we're talking about vision, persuasion, strategy, innovation, right? Not the life and death decisions, the context in which those decisions are made, right? The business environment those decisions are made. And there's forms of failure that are both good and bad. I'm a huge fan of this framework from Amy Edmondson, who says that, look, there's strategies from learning from failure, right? There's praiseworthy failure and there's blameworthy failure, right? We should not celebrate failure if it's because you had a certain set of principles or a policy or a process that you have identified and you failed to follow it. That's not success, right? That's not productive failure. You're going to learn nothing from failing to follow your own procedures. But by contrast, if you had an idea that, hey, people want to do this, people want to engage with my business in this way, people want my service in this way, people want to be part of our brand, our enterprise, our team. How are you testing that hypothesis? How are you exploring what's going on out there? So this spectrum between praiseworthy and blameworthy is something that we really invite students to explore. How do you come in and start to figure out how to make a failure your teacher, right? Not a thing to be afraid of, but your teacher. And maybe you fail in different ways. Maybe you don't fail in your day job. Maybe you fail at night in your hobbies, in your extracurriculars, in your volunteer positions. And so again, the much more interesting question is when I invite students to the front of the room and I ask, give me an example of a strategic failure. And it turns out we can start to learn a lot more about how the world works when we think about when things went wrong, right? That whether it was really clear or not clear, if there was a good team in place, if there's good management structure in place, a good organizational vision. This all gets revealed from our mistakes rather than from our successes. The other thing that I put a lot of emphasis on in my curriculum and teaching is the fact that I recognize that we are all in a world that's changing rapidly, right? That artificial intelligence is, some people are afraid of AI is coming for your job, right? And then one of the classic counterpoints to that is like, well, AI is not coming for your job. Someone better at AI than you is coming for your job. The framing that I heard recently is like, you should make AI afraid for its job. And so what does that look like? How do you making sure that you stay ahead of what AI can do? And so one of the concepts that I always get students to explore in our academic settings is this idea of what's called a jagged frontier, right? AI is capable of lots of different things. That's the dashed line here. Let's imagine that frontier, right? And pardon me, the solid blue line is what AI is good at. AI right now is good at really, really good at some things. Like you are never going to be better at AI than writing a poem where the second word always starts with the letter A. It's going to be great at that and it'll just kill it. It'll provide you endless content. Now, is it that poem any good? Well, that's where your judgment matters, right? AI is really good at writing the initial draft of a cover letter, but is it the right tone? Is it respectful? Is it culturally relevant? That's where your judgment comes into play. And one of the things that I personally try to do, but also invite my students to do, is to be constantly benchmarking yourself against AI. Every time a new model comes out, what are you doing to to test whether that new model can take some part of your job and do it better and unlock your skills, enhance your skills? And so I think that by the time you all start your program in January, this is going to just have taken another step change every few months, a new version of cloud or Gemini, or obviously most famously ChatGPT comes along and is able to do things that it didn't used to do. And you have to be able to evaluate, okay, is that now a task that I can hand off to that tool? Or is that tool now able to augment me in a way that 1 or 2 years ago it could not? Because a lot of people's impressions of AI are shaped by their first interactions with AI, right? And they saw ChatGPT 3.5 make a mistake, and they're like, oh, this tool is flawed. I can't trust it. But the difference between ChatGPT 3.5 and 4.0 and 4.03 and 4.03 Pro, like these things, every time there's a step change in the model's ability to reason and predict and to make augment you. So I would encourage you, if you're looking for something to read over the summer or into the fall in preparation for these programs, is to read a book called Co-Intelligence by a professor at Wharton School of Business, Ethan Mullick. And he offers this really great framework about how you need to think about your job and all the tasks that make up your day. And you think about, what are the tasks that I don't want to hand off to AI, right? What are the things that are just really important to me? Like, I love writing a cover letter. I love that first draft. I love writing my thoughts down. I don't want to work with AI on this particular task. But there's also tasks where I'm completely happy to delegate the summarizing these meeting minutes, right? I'm happy to have to delegate to AI. Hey, help me think through some of the strategic blind spots in this memo that I've written. And then there could be tasks where you want AI to do the automation. Find a time in my calendar to do X, right? Create an image for the cover of my presentation, whatever it might be, right? So there's you have to start to get a little more thoughtful about what you do over the course of a work day and how that can be parsed out. The other thing you have to get thoughtful about is, are you a centaur or a cyborg? And the centaur is the Greek mythological creature, which was the body of a horse with a man or woman on top, right? And the creature was driven by the brain and the arms of the human attached to the horse. And the AI in this instance is the horse. It's the thing that drives you forward. Like, but at the end of the day, you're in charge. You're making the decisions. Sometimes you consult with your horse counterpart, but most of the time you're just kind of driving things forward. Or are there people, and I've met them, who want to be a cyborg? Like, give me AI all the time. I don't do anything without it. It's replaced Google search for me. It's replaced my email inbox. It's replaced the first draft of any document. I don't even start a project. I don't start a thought without talking to ChatGPT, right? Thinking about what it thinks, what it needs. So a question that I would invite you to sort of reflect on and certainly spend some time over the months ahead working on is thinking about how AI is disrupting how you do work today. And for some of us, it's not disrupting us at all. For example, I think oddly enough, you could imagine a world where predictive tasks, like a highly trained specialist in the medical field, is actually under more risk of AI than an emotional specialist or someone who has human skills or emotional intelligence, right? AI may not be disruptive to the world of nursing as it is to the world of a doctor. Right? There's some interesting dynamics playing out there. But the other thing that you should have some position on in the midst of this transition is, what disruption do you anticipate in the future? Right? If AI gets better at X, what does the job of an architect look like? If it gets better at Y, what is the job of a planner? What is the job of an engineer? What tasks are going to become increasingly important? And you can see that I would argue AI is going to be an enabler for foxes. It's going to make foxes stronger. It's going to reward foxes, right? It's going to reward people who want to step out of their lane, get curious, get imaginative, love to wrestle with some of these sort of ambiguities around strategy and innovation that we've been talking about today. So I think I'll end my comments there. sort of going on for 32 minutes here, and I need a sip of coffee. I'm happy to take any questions about the academic content that I've been talking about today or the courses that I teach. But we also have Yola and Reynold here from our MEL MHLP administrative team to answer any procedural questions that you might have about the program, registration, housing, visa. I don't know what. They're very well qualified to answer lots of different questions. Feel free to just throw up your hand or just unmute yourself or use chat as well. Or if you need to drop and get start your day, no one's going to be offended if you have to do that as well. So thank you again for your time today. And I look forward to working with many of you in just a few short months.